Well, since you've all gone quiet again, we'd better start, haven't we? So welcome. It's great to be here with you for this, our annual chaplaincy lecture at the University of Leicester, part of the bigger series of the Bishop of Leicester's chaplaincy lectures in the 3 universities across this county. It's great to have Vice Chancellor Nishan with us, and who will be bringing us our concluding remarks later, and also, of course, to have Bishop Martin. And a big welcome to Reverend Dr. Israel, our speaker. Bishop Martin will introduce Israel more formally in a little while. I know some of us have heard that the white smoke has gone up at the Vatican and you're all waiting to find out who, but if we can sort of pay attention when Israel starts talking, that'd probably be preferable. My name's Luke and I'm the Anglican and coordinating chaplain to the university here, and it's my job just to say a bit about that for a couple of minutes as we get underway and as some of our team of helpers make their way in. So don't mind them, they're not late, they've been helping out. So as many of you will know, the chaplaincy to the University of Leicester is constituted as a Christian charity. So we're actually not the university, but we are part of the university community. We're part of the ecosystem, and we sort of exist in this symbiotic relationship, I suppose. The chaplaincy exists purely to welcome and support the students and staff of this university. And the university, in turn, over the last 34 years, has always supported us and helped us out with bits and pieces that enable us to run sustainably and healthily. We offer welcome and spiritual support for students of all faiths and none. So that looks like all kinds of things day to day, everything from prayer group for staff who are Christians who work here, through to lunches for international students to help welcome them to a new country and help them feel settled and belong. Similar events for postgraduate students who are sometimes isolated and a little lonely, working hard on their own schedule. Sometimes it's helping people to explore faith, or equipping and working with student societies, and helping people to ask those biggest questions of life in ways that are appropriate and allows them to go on their own journey and make up their own minds. And other times it is more of just a pure support, whatever someone's own faith position or background might be. We can help them and love them from within the framework of our Christian faith. We've been running things like bereavement courses online aimed at university staff, which there's actually no religious component to. There's an extra session at the end if they want to explore those, but we don't discuss faith for most of it. And then, of course, a lot of it is one-to-one, maybe as we build a relationship, or maybe with someone who we only meet once and we get to come alongside them. That's what the word chaplain means, and journey with them and offer that sense of support. So that's who we are. I hope that those of you who are the praying sorts will pray for us. We are a charity, so you can even give us some money if you want, but that's not really why we've got you here. Okay. And the last thing I need to say is just that this event, this annual lecture, is partly made possible through the generous legacy of the late Venerable Derek Hole. So we're grateful for that, enabling this event to continue. And I believe some of Derek's nearest and dearest are here tonight as well. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Bishop Martin. It is the Bishop of Leicester's chaplaincy lecture series, so I'm going to sit down and let him run the rest of this.
Thank you very much, Luke, and a very good evening to you all. Warm welcome to you. First of all, a particular thanks to Nishan and to the university for hosting us this evening. It is very much a joint event between myself as Bishop and the university here, and we're delighted to be able to do it. A number of you will have been to previous events that we've had either here or at De Montfort University or Loughborough University. We're really privileged to have links with all 3 universities. So thank you for coming along this evening, and it's a great joy to be able to welcome Reverend Dr. Israel Olofinjana, who is our speaker this evening. We've been friends for some while, going back to my own time working in Gloucestershire, where I was on the board of a college, a training college in Gloucestershire, at the time when Israel also joined that same board. So we first got to know each other then. And at that time, Israel was a Baptist pastor working with a church in London, I think it was at that time, wasn't it? Yes. and but already involved in a number of sort of wider projects as well. So he'd started some writing, has written quite a number of books, which I'll come to in a moment, but was already doing some research more widely, as well as supporting various different training colleges and churches across the country. So his very particular focus has been around what's come to be called reverse mission. So the idea that just as missionaries were sent from Europe primarily to other parts of the world 100, 200 years ago and so on, that actually that is now being replicated by other countries sending missionaries to the UK to start new churches here. And so Israel has been doing a lot of research on how those churches have gone about that work, and where there are good things in what they are doing, but also where actually they may be repeating some of the mistakes that Europeans made many years ago. So, as I say, Israel has written a number of different books on that, everything from African voices towards African British theologies, so bringing together a number of different writers of African heritage, but working in this country now, to partnership in mission, to discipleship, suffering and racial justice, to reverse missionary and ministry and mission and others. That gives you a little flavour, if you like, of the sort of work that he's been involved in. We had a discussion as we were eating together earlier about the title for this evening. And I should be very interested to see when we come to questions after Israel's lecture as to what you make of it. There is, of course, a whole programme around decolonisation of the curricula in universities and more widely, but it is not uncontroversial. So it will be very interesting to see what you make of all of that. But as I say, I'm delighted that Israel has been able to come and join us this evening. He has brought a few resources with him as well. So, sorry, I should have said his day job now is working with the Evangelical Alliance, as it's called, which is an organisation that brings together various different denominations to work together. He leads part of it known as the One World Commission, so looking particularly as to how people of different cultures interact and come together. And they have produced various different resources. So I think these are free for people to take. Is that right, Israel? So they are. So outside in the foyer area there, you'll find some of these later. Do take one of those if you would like to, and do go and look at some of the books that I mentioned as well, which can be bought online. But for now, let me ask you to put your hands together to say a warm welcome to Reverend Dr. Israel Olofinjana.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here this evening. Thank you very much, Bishop Martin, for inviting me. I think I got the invitation almost a year ago, so it's been in the pipeline and it's been in my mind for several months ago in that sense. And it's good to be in the city of Leicester. I love coming to Leicester because of the diversity and the food. Even only this afternoon, myself and Bishop Martin, we've enjoyed a Turkish food. So, just that. So if I'm falling asleep, you could know why, because of the good food in that sense. So just to lay some caveats down, because what I want to look this evening, I'm very much aware that it's, for various reasons, the word decolonization triggers various things for various people. For example, if you come from a colonized context, such as Africa or Asia or Latin America, these words mean different things to different people. But also I'm aware that in the European context, it means different things to different people as well. So I find myself in spaces where sometimes I've used this word and people have sort of asked, why are you using this word? So I'm very much aware that these words triggers in various sense, but I'm using it because of a particular reason, which I'm going to explain as we continue in this conversation. And I think, as Bishop Martin mentioned, we are in a season where there's a lot of conversations around decolonization, decolonizing development, There's a conversation going on there in terms of how we do development. There's decolonization around education in terms of educational frameworks and stuff, decolonizing curriculum, decolonizing theological education, and in that sense. And then I felt it was important for us to look at why the church needs decolonizing as well, because the church has a history and it has a legacy that we need to interrogate in that sense. Two things why this conversation is important for us to have. One is we're coming to the 5 years since the death of George Floyd. So I don't know where you are during the pandemic when the death of George Floyd took place, but what I remember was that it became a catalyst for conversations around decolonization. It became a catalyst for conversations around racial justice. It became a catalyst for conversation around justice issues in that sense. So 5 years is coming on, 25th of May. There's actually a national service that is going to be taking place to mark that in London, which is organized by some of the national churches, including the Church of England and other denominations in that sense. So there is that. But a second reason why this conversation is important is that this year, there are two key anniversaries that is important to the church. The first one has to do with something called the Nicene Creed. To those who go to church, you might be familiar with the Nicene Creed. It's a popular statement of faith, of what the church believes about the Trinity and the church. And this year, around October, it's going to be 1,700 years since the Nicene Council took place, in Turkey, which back then was called, Constantinople in that sense. So that's an anniversary that is significant to some of the conversation we're going to have this evening. A second is 140 years since the partitioning and the colonization of African countries by 7 European powers. So between 1884 and 1885, there was a conference that took place in Berlin, organized by the Chancellor, a German Chancellor, bringing 7 European powers and other interested parties around how the new markets in Africa were going to be carved out. So it's 140 years. On the surface, the Nicene Council and the partitioning of African countries contrast like they have nothing to do with each other. But actually, when you interrogate history, and particularly church history, you realize that actually there is a lot of intersection, and that is some of the things I want to explore this evening as well in that sense. So I just thought it's important to give those caveats in that sense. But our starting point has to be to look at the roots of Christianity in the person that, in the person of Jesus and the things that it stood for and how Christianity was on the margins when it started. Jesus himself was born into a poor family, a poor background. I mean, the family were so poor that when Jesus was being dedicated, they couldn't afford the normal ritual sacrifices that you would normally do. They had to use a sort of a prescription for a poor average family in those days to just show to the extent to which they were very poor. So Jesus was born into a very underprivileged family, you could say, in that sense. And he was born into a colony. And I think it's important to begin to state that, because oftentimes there's a way we read scripture and detach Jesus of Nazareth living under Roman occupation or under Roman colonization. And what is the impact of that on Jesus? Or what is the impact of that on the world of Christianity? I think it's very important to begin to think around that. And so the Christianity that developed through Jesus and his followers and, who became apostles later, was a kind of a Christianity that lived on the margins of the Roman Empire. Was a kind of a faith that wasn't center stage, was a kind of a faith that attracted a lot of poor, marginalized people. But as history continued, we must ask the question, how did then Christianity end up from being from developing and evolving under colonization and then transforming to becoming a kind of a religion that colluded with empire and colonization? When did that transition happen? When did that shift took place that took Christianity from being a marginal religion to becoming something that embraces empire? When did that happen? And what are the things that we can learn from that so that for our ongoing development and thinking in that sense? But in that respect, one of the important things that needs to be said is that the world that Jesus lived in, as I said, recognized that there was an emperor. There was Octavius Caesar, who actually had this idea of good news. And what I mean by that is that today we talk about gospels, but actually the word gospel, the way it was first of all used, was not necessarily by Jesus and his disciples. The word gospel, the way it was first of all used, was in Greek text, and then later was adopted by the Romans to sort of use it to understand the peace achievements of Augustus Caesar. He ushered in something called the Pax Romana, that is the Roman peace. And so many saw him as a god, a demigod, that ushered in good news because he brought an end to wars, and in that sense. And so for many folks in Rome, Caesar is the good news. Augustus Caesar is the good news. And so when the gospel writers and Jesus started talking about the good news, centering it in the life, the suffering, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, they were being countercultural, they were being counterintuitive to say, actually, the idea and the notion of gospel, of good news for all people, is not rooted in power. It is not concentrated in empire, but it is actually concentrated in the ideals of God's kingdom, which is reflected in the Sermon on the Mount, or the Beatitudes as we know it today, where the character of God's kingdom was fleshed out in terms of how we live with each other and embrace kingdom ideals. So the notion of the gospel that Jesus embodies and that the later disciples embody was actually a very apologetic in a sense of defending a different idea and notions around power. So in a sense, it's not rooted in power, but it is rooted in empowering a marginalized community. That was the sense and the notion of the gospel that Jesus and the disciples developed. And so that's the genesis of our faith for those who are Christians. That's the genesis of Christianity. That is what it is about. And Jesus lived that throughout his whole life, washing the disciples' feet, dying on the cross because of what he believed that this is the right thing to do and this is the way. The path to power was through suffering, not through a corrupt, toxic way of displaying power and pomp, which later entered the church in that sense. And so the gospel of Jesus challenges the gospel of Rome, and it challenges the divinity of Caesar Augustus in that sense, and in a way subverts that in that sense. And so when Jesus died and moved on, the disciples continued this communal, I suppose the best way to describe it is kenotic Christianity. And what I mean by that is there is a text in scripture in Philippians that talks about Jesus not holding on to power, not clinging, even though it was God himself, it's part of the Trinity, but he didn't hold on to that notion or to that idea in order to minister to humanity in that sense. He let go of power. He emptied himself. So the word kenosis is the Greek word for emptying. And so Jesus' understanding of this kenotic lifestyle, or what we would describe as kenotic Christianity, continued through the disciples of Jesus. And it challenges what you would say the key characteristics that describe the colonial empires around Jesus' day. Whether you look at it from the Egyptian empire to the Babylonian to the Persian to the Greek to the Roman, one of the key dominant things around them was power, control, imperialism, division, and exploitation. Whereas this kenotic Christianity has a different kind of value. And this continued through Acts of the Apostles, through the disciples of Jesus. And we also see this form of Christianity continued in the first sort of 200, 300 years of the church in terms of what we describe as patristic period. That is the period of the church fathers where there were different church leaders from different regions around the world who were leading and writing about their reflections around Jesus and Christianity and so on. To the extent that many were willing, the way they expressed this kenotic Christianity during the patristic period was through martyrdom. Many of them were ready to die for their faith. In fact, there was a North African Christian by the name of Tertullian who commented as he started observing how many Christians were willing to die for their faith. And he was able to comment and say, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, or the seedbed of the church. And what he meant by that was that as Christians were laying down their life for what they believe in, not holding on to power, not holding on to this notion of control, but letting go because of their vision and their idea around the church. As that was going on, people were convinced that there is something in this faith that these people are living out, and Christianity began to grow from there. So this is the text I mentioned earlier about kenotic idea of Jesus. So instead of power, he let go, he emptied himself in that very sense. And again, instead of a kind of a nationalistic, imperialistic thinking, it struck me, one of the things that struck me about the way Jesus conducted himself, he challenged the gospel of Rome. But one would have expected that maybe his ideas would have been aligned with the religious leaders of Israel. But Jesus also challenged the religious leaders of his day. They were called the Pharisees and the Sadducees. His thinking also challenged them. But then he went even further. He challenged his disciples who suddenly they were asking him, when are you going to return the power to Israel? And he didn't really answer their question. If you look at that text in Acts of the Apostles, he didn't really. Because Jesus didn't embrace a kind of a notion of nationalism that the other ideas, other people might have, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were very nationalistic in their thinking for various reasons. And also the disciples who were thinking Israel has been losing power for such a long time. When is that power going to come back to us? And Jesus was neither here and there. And so I say to people that when I look at the gospel that Jesus presented, it is not right wing or left wing. It is not right wing, because one of the struggles we have today is that people try to align the gospel with either left wing politics or right wing politics. Whereas when you look at the politics of Jesus through the gospel, it either aligned to the left or to the right. That doesn't mean it was neutral, but it went about in a way of carving out something totally different that challenged his followers, that challenged the religious leaders, and also challenged the secular authorities of his day, the Roman government. That is an uncomfortable place to be. And that's where Jesus found himself with his message. And the disciples had no choice but to continue in that message, in that sense. So instead of superior attitude, again, we talked about he was poor, he was humble. Again, in those days, many of the leaders will ride a horse, whether it's Alexander the Great or the pharaohs. But when Jesus is entry into Jerusalem, which oftentimes we describe as the triumphant entry, which is a wrong term to use to say Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. Because Jesus was not about being triumphant. It was actually a humble entrance into Jerusalem, because he wasn't riding a horse like Alexander the Great. He was riding on a donkey. And so, again, Jesus' attitude was very different. And so I'm describing this kenotic Christianity as Jesus decolonizing ethics. And what I mean by that is, here's the thing. Jesus didn't go about everyday business campaigning with a placard and saying, we want Rome to be, we want to decolonize ourselves. No, he didn't. That's not the way Jesus operated. He didn't rally people around to say, let's storm, let's fight the Romans. And I was also again struck by the fact that one of the disciples of Jesus is called Simon the Zealot, which simply means that here was a nationalist who would have had a dagger in his pouch ready to kill a Roman soldier. Jesus had one of those in his midst. He also has sons of thunders who had anger issues. In that sense, just all sorts of people. But the way he lived with them for about 3.5 years or thereabout was showing them that actually the way to power was through humility. The way to attain true power was through the Holy Spirit. Those are the kind of things that Jesus emphasized, not through a conquering attitude, not through a divide and rule attitude, but through a sort of an intercultural lens of embracing different people. Whether that is the Samaritans, Jesus told a story to the effect that the Samaritan was a hero, to which Jews would have been like, what is he chatting about? That is just wrong. So he challenged a lot of things. And so this is Jesus decolonizing ethics around power and control and imperialism and exploitation and division in that sense. And he did that, and as I said, his disciples continued that. Instead of exploitation, generosity, offering himself, not asking for things to be taken. In that sense, the New Testament church continued that. The patristic church continued that through martyrdom, as I mentioned, that, bearing witness to this idea. But then as this continued, something happened, shifts were happening during the Roman period of history. And one of it was that Constantine emerged as a key leader. There were other leaders, other emperors at this time, but he emerged as the sole emperor in that sense and created an Edict of Milan, which some would describe as perhaps one of the first public policy around religious freedom, because it kind of stopped the persecution of Christians who, at this particular time, a lot of Christians were dying for their faith, as I said. So he stopped that because Constantine embraced Christianity, in that sense. And as a result of him embracing Christianity, I suppose, put it this way, we can second guess what happened, whether it was truly converted or not converted. None of us were there. No historian was actually there in that sense. These are things that have been written for us to reflect on, going back to that particular time. But he did embrace Christianity, and he organized an ecumenical council, which is very significant, as I said, in AD 325, because it is at this council that the Nicene Creed was formulated in that sense. And so, on the one hand, this Nicene Council is a good thing because it speaks about the unity of the church, trying to unify the church. But at the same time, it sowed some seedbed that I think we're still trying to recover from in terms of the church. And so what that simply means that the church that was on the margins became no longer a church on the margins, because the church went from vulnerability to appropriating power, because Constantine, the emperor, is now a Christian. And so the alignment between church and state fused together, integrated together. The church went from being under, from being margins to center margin, and most importantly, the church went from being under colony, that is under colonization, under Roman colonization, to actually be on the side of colonization. Two forms of Christianity continue to emerge from this phase onward. Triumphant Christianity, which you will associate with this Constantinian shift, with that power. And then a kenotic Christianity that goes back to what I've been describing so far. And the way the kenotic Christianity was expressed was actually through monasticism. And so one of the things that took place is that there were groups of people who were uncomfortable with where the church is at this particular time, because they felt that church is become very powerful. So some people took to the deserts, to start praying and to start seeking God in a new form. And that led to, monasticism, this idea of pursuing God in solitary confinement, through community and so on. And so you have a group of African church leaders called African Desert Fathers. You have Anthony from Egypt. You have Paul of Thebes, again from Egypt. And then you have Pachomius, again from Egypt. So you have African church leaders who were dissatisfied or who were not fully sure about this shift in the church and started African monasticism. And from there, this idea of kenotic Christianity through monasticism spread to other parts in that sense. One of the influences of African monasticism in Europe is on Celtic Christianity. I do not have much time to be able to delve deeper into the influence, African influence on Celtic Christianity, because Celtic Christianity is an indigenous form of Christianity in the British Isles that developed in several places in Ireland, in Scotland, and in Wales, and in north of England. But again, when you look at some of the ideals around monastic living and style, they were ideas that were borrowed from African monasticism. But as I said, I don't have time to unpack that. That's a whole area of research to look into, which I'm working on at the moment. But maybe when we come to questions, I might be able to answer some questions around that. But what I'm trying to get across here is that kenotic Christianity continued through monasticism, not triumphant Christianity that we see that emerged here in that sense. This Constantinian form of Christianity continued to evolve and impacted ecclesiastical structures. Obviously, before this time, the idea of the hierarchy of the church was already in formation. But at this particular time, this endorsed those things and endorsed those processes in that sense, and endorsed ambitious building projects like the basilicas that were commissioned by Constantine and his family in that sense, and other things that developed at this particular time. And so during the medieval period, which is a long period, again, we continue to see these two forms of Christianity. Kenotic Christianity through monasticism continued, but also this triumphant Christianity continued to express itself in various forms in that sense. And so by the time we get to the towards almost the end of the medieval period, we began to see some semblance of how this is expressed in that sense. I must say at this point that I'm using Africa as a case study. We could look at Asia. We could look at Latin America. There are these examples that one can pick from each of those continents, but I'm focusing on the continent of Africa for this set of discussion. And so there is a doctrine, the doctrine of discovery, rooted in Christopher Columbus discovering the so-called New World, as if those people were not there before. Obviously, we know they were there before. But that doctrine of discovery began to fuel something else. And what it began to fuel was a kind of an expansionist Christianity that began to go to other parts of the world to preach the gospel, but not just to preach the gospel, but also to conquer people and to take lands. And so this fusion of Christianity with conquering became very much expressed in this particular period. And this was very much expressed in Africa. And again, it was expressed by the then popes, commissioning people to go and subjugate other lands, to take other lands in that sense. So people have papal blessings. The Pope of those days were very powerful. The popes can grant lands, they can bless kings, they can settle disputes and so on and so forth in that sense. So rights were given to people to go in the name of Christ to conquer, as it were, in that particular sense. And we see this happening in the context of Africa with Portuguese explorers that came to the continent, starting to explore the mineral resources and the navigational aspect, the coastal areas of West Africa into Southern Africa. And as that continued, came with their faith, came with the Catholic faith in that sense. And so there are cases in West Africa of Portuguese traders coming and saying to indigenous West Africans that accept Christ, or if you don't, it's going to be battle. In that sense, it's going to be this and that. And there was also trade by barter, which was also going on. So this fusion of Christianity with colonization and enslavement was very real at this particular time. Of course, we know the triangular slave trade emerged from this, that began to take slaves from Africa into the so-called New World, and then returning the goods to Europe, and then again the commercialization going back to Africa in that sense. So this period had those sanctions from the popes for it to continue. Oftentimes people ask me, why did the slave trade went on for so long? It was because part of it was sanctioned by the church to a lot of extent, or the church profited from it to some extent. So in that sense, so that was part of the reasons why it went on for so long. But it's very important to say this is not just a Catholic thing, because what I've been talking about so far reflects on the Catholic Church. In that sense, there is a Protestant version to this conversation, which we cannot ignore. So I'm looking at both Catholic and Protestants in that sense. So, and I suppose the modern missionary movement, the evangelical mission movement that went to Asia, Latin America, and Africa, again, went in an interesting time. So in terms of the case study of Africa, modern European mission started around the 1820s. In that sense, 1820s, 1840s, as revival were taking place across both Atlantic, Great Awakenings in the United States, evangelical revival in Britain, missionaries, there was a renewed sense of mission, and people started to move out in that sense. But around the same time, because here's the thing, slavery went on till obviously 1807, slavery was abolished, or the slave trade was abolished, but slavery continued into the 1840s, both in the Caribbean and in Africa. It continued for such a long time. But there were constant discussion around, and this is a European conversation, around we have traded with Africans in an illegitimate way. In essence, we have traded with Africans through slave trade, which has been dehumanizing. There is the need to trade with Africans through a legitimate trade. And one of the things that led to that was colonization of the continent. So colonization was actually seen as a tool of legitimate trade. That was some of the intentions of that period, that let's trade with Africans through a legitimate period, through a legitimate way. Except when that meeting in 1884, 1885 took place with European leaders, there was no single African tribal chief. So imagine a continent was about to be carved. The people themselves were not even aware that there was a meeting taking place, let alone to understand their continents were going to be carved in that sense. And so Christian mission took a different turn around this period, because mission in this particular period was understood as Europeans bringing light to hidden Africans, to pagan Africans, to Africans who needed civilization, but through Christianity, but also through commerce in that sense. So there was an intermingling. And again, I have to be very careful. Not all missionaries, not all European missionaries fought like that. And not all European missionaries executed things like that. There were European missionaries who had a completely different way of operating on the basis of kenotic Christianity. There were lots of European missionaries who died on the continent of Africa, sacrificing everything that they had. When they were leaving the shores of Europe to go to Africa, they knew that they were not coming back because of the sacrifice of the gospel. So it's important for me to mention that and to amplify that, to say that there were missionaries in this particular period who had good intentions and who exercised kenotic Christianity, that sense of sacrifice, that sense of empowering rather than power in that sense. But equally, there were those who there was a mixture and a conflation with colonial clerks and administration. Even sometimes missionaries were understood as colonial tools or colonial imperialists in that sense, who operated at this particular time. And so the net effect of some of these strategies, these are the countries, the 7 countries that I mentioned, that I talked about, but the effect of this particular period on Christian mission or the church is that it wasn't, put it this way, as colonization was, as land was being taken, resources being taken, identities were also being reshaped. And so for many Africans, we speak our indigenous languages, but I have not come across any African that does not speak a European language, at least 1 or 2. And that's as a result of colonization in that sense. So I speak English, and one of the legacies of colonization on my own self is that in my primary school in Nigeria, when we tried to speak in my language, Yoruba, I'm Yoruba Nigerian, we were actually very discouraged from speaking Yoruba. We were told to speak in English because English is seen as better than my language. I have written 9 books in English. Ask me to write 1 book in my language and you will find me wanting. And that's as a result of the impact of colonization. So what I'm talking about is very real for myself and a lot of people, the impact of that. But the Christian mission or church at this particular time, the impact of that is through some of the practices such as baptism. So when people get baptized or confirmed, they took on a European name. So take, for example, the first African bishop, Samuel Crowder. That is not his name. That is the name of a vicar here in the UK that he was named after. His actual name is Ajayi, which is your Yoruba name from my city or your state in Nigeria. And so you have folk, you have people's name changed, people speaking European languages in that sense. But not just only that, dressing like Victorians. And so in those days, you don't just only become a Christian, you become a Victorian Christian. You dress Victorian, you sound Victorian, you eat Victorian, you speak Victorian. The house you live in is styled in a Victorian style. I can take you to some places in Nigeria where you look at the buildings. Some of it will mirror the Portuguese architecture. Some of it will mirror Victorian architecture. And there are places like that all over in that sense. And so Christian mission was fused around colonization, the way things were done at this particular time in that sense. So, as I begin to round off, these are the key characteristics of colonization: power, control, division, exploitation, and nationalism. But one of the things that is important to mention is that these are not just things of the past in terms of looking at colonial kingdoms, but actually these are things that are still seen mirrored in the church today. And this is displayed in different ways. So for example, power. The way sometimes this is displayed is through branding, profiling, platforms. Who do we platform in our churches? Who do we, when we talk about branding within the church, what is the impact of that? Who's doing the branding and for who in that sense? And again, that ties into a sense of control. Control in the sense of Christian mission. So there are still a lot of places where missionaries from the majority world are still very dependent on Europe and United States. So resources become the controlling factor in that sense, because even though Christianity has shifted and we talk about the majority of Christians being in the global south, the reality is that the resources are still in the global north. And so the power factor within that comes to play. Division, again, here's the thing. If you are building platforms and brandings, that is building our own empires. And sometimes in building our own empires, there is division, there is competition, again, which I see still happening in the church. And again, what is important to say here is this, that when I'm talking of these characteristics, I'm not only saying this just in British, white, European Christians. I also see it in majority world Christians. So, for example, when we talk about power or we talk about exploitation, take prosperity gospel, for example, which is very popular among Africans and Latin Americans to some extent. Again, that's another form of exploitation and power. And so this impacts both of us, not just Europeans. This impacts Africans as well in that particular sense. And of course, nationalism. It's interesting that last week we had reform. This is getting political and dangerous ground. So we had reform taking many of the local councillor seats in that sense. And I think the trajectory of what the commentators are saying is that in the next general election, there's just that possibility that there might be a split between Labour and Reform, that we are shifting from conservative to Reform. Now, if you observe what's going on in Europe and, of course, United States, I won't mention the T word, don't worry. But if you observe all those dynamics, there is a rise of far-right nationalism. Now, there are reasons why that is happening, and we can talk about that. But what I'm perhaps more interested is the Christian language sometimes that is used in those conversations when it comes to the rise of nationalism, the Christian symbolisms, the language and the rhetoric that comes into that. So again, that's something that I think it's important to mention. So Jesus developed some key decolonizing tools that we need for today. And I think part of that is interculturality. And the reason why I'm looking at intercultural approach to this idea of how we decolonize the church is because for so long, the way we talk about this subject has been from an indigenous approach or hermeneutics or perspective. That's one. The other is through a kind of a post-colonial approach. And again, that's important. I understand the reasons why we need an indigenous approach and a post-colonial approach. But I think we need an intercultural approach to this conversation. And the reason is, I think when it comes to colonization is impacted, I'm using the language that, again, that is very triggering. So I do accept that, as I said from the start, but just bear with me. Because I think for descendants of colonizers and the descendants of the colonized, there is an impact on both of us. Hence, we need an intercultural perspective that not just look at it from the perspective of those who were colonized or the descendants of those who were colonized, but also the impact of that on the descendants of people who colonized. Why? Because when I look at the cross, an intercultural perspective of understanding the cross is actually that because Jesus lived under Roman occupation, the cross was actually a colonial tool used by the Romans to execute people who are not conforming to colonial patterns. And so here we have Jesus being crucified by a colonial tool, but also living as under colony. So the cross, in my mind, is the only bridge that can help the descendants of the colonized and those descendants of those who colonized to be able to bridge the gap, because the cross is a colonial tool that was used to crucify the colonized. And so that intercultural perspective of the cross is very powerful for us to be able to bridge the gap and to speak about reconciliation and unity in today's perspective. And the expression of that will be 5 marks of how we decolonize the church. So instead of power, mission shaped through vulnerability. Instead of control, mission shaped by humility. Instead of division, mission shaped by unity. And instead of nationalism or imperialism, and I must clarify, Every one of us, we are nationalistic. I'm very nationalistic as a Nigerian. So I'm not attacking the idea of having a sense or a notion of being proud of your country. That's not what I'm attacking. What I think I'm uncomfortable is a toxic kind of nationalism that demonizes other people, or a toxic kind of nationalism that demonizes migrants. That is the one that I have a problem with. So I have no problem with nationalism, but the toxic form or versions of that in that sense. And then lastly, instead of exploitation, mission shaped by generosity. And it is in my mind that if we do these things, we'll be able to move some of the conversation forward through this intercultural perspective. I'm going to finish there because I feel I've talked for too long. And if you want to know more or read more, here's a resource, something that I've just written about this that you can access through that link in that sense. And some of the stuff I've spoken about is there. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Israel, and that's been quite a journey through church history and around the world as well, so thank you enormously for that. We're going to come to questions, an opportunity for you to ask your questions to Israel. But as often at these events, as chair, I suppose I'm going to jump in first to give people time to think as well. But also on this occasion as well, to avoid anyone else asking the obvious question, because I'm stood here as a bishop in the Church of England, having spent this morning in the House of Lords, the centre of power, if you like, for the United Kingdom. I've reflected on this a lot in terms of questions of power. There's a sense in which you've used the word power, I suppose, in quite a negative sense of power over other people. It can be used in a good sense, though, as well. Yes. Would you agree? Do you want to explore that?
Yes, it can be. And I think, as we were talking earlier, I was sharing with you about my admiration for Pope Francis, because here is someone who, in a global position of power and privilege, but yet he displayed kenotic Christianity in a very practical way that I think it's challenged me as a person to think, okay, it's possible to be in a position of that level of power, but to demonstrate humility, to demonstrate vulnerability, to demonstrate something that we don't often see. And I think the way he went about his ministry, the way he carried himself, the way he embraced the idea of liberation for different people is admirable. So it's possible for power to be used in a very positive way, to be channeled through that kenotic Christianity. And I think Pope Francis demonstrated that very clearly. And I'm hoping that, I don't know whether the smoke has gone up, but whoever the next Pope is, hoping and praying that they'll be able to continue that which is starting. So power can be used in a positive way.
That's right. Thank you very much. I'm relieved, but also deeply challenged by that. So thank you. Let's open it up. Do say if you like. We thought we were going to have a roving mic, but I don't think we have. So should we try it? Should we try it again to see if it is doing anything? No.
Do I need to switch it on?
Oh, that is doing something now, isn't it? Yes. Does that helps a bit? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's try that. Who would like to ask a question today? Oh, okay. That's very kind of you. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask a rather simplistic question, actually? I suspect if you ask most people what they think about the words that Jesus spoke and what Jesus was actually talking about, translated into any language you wish, very few people would actually disagree with that, in the sense that what he is saying is actually very human and very beneficial to all people, whether they be poor or rich. Yet, when we move to all these activities, we forget what was said, and we look at structures, we look at organizations. And I think, I hear what you say about colonizing, and absolutely right, but it does seem to me that somehow the simple words that people can agree about are lost in all this. And what you're looking at is more political in this larger sense, and therefore moves away from anything that Jesus might have said. And I just wonder if that is something that somebody needs to consider.
No, thank you. I do agree that at the basic level, the way Jesus communicated and the way he did his ministry was very effective because he communicated clearly. He loved the poor, he helped a lot of people. And the simplicity of that, I think we need to keep it at the heart of our Christianity. But I don't know how we use the word politics. In my mind, the word politics means about people. You know, the idea of politics in its original language is about people. It's about community. And again, we could say that Jesus had his own politics, but his politics was actually about community, about people. And that is what I'm sort of trying to draw emphasis on, that Jesus' politics challenged the politics of Rome. So should our Christianity today be doing that, challenging the common ideologies that are out there. Yes, it can be simplified at the basic level, but also because we are having some important conversation at the political dimension and other dimensions. So if we're going to stick into that, we need some language to help us to engage those conversations as well as God's people, as Christians, as community, in that sense. So, but I do agree that at the basic level, what Jesus communicated, it's very clear and effective, and sometimes maybe we complicate it in that sense. At the heart of it was that he loved people, you know, and he was willing to die for that, in order for humanity to be saved. That is the summary of the gospel. But that in itself is a local politics that challenged the power of those days. Thank you very much.
I think I can project, but I'll try this anyway. I think for most of human history, we have lived with empires. And Rome inherited the empire of Alexander. And there were, during the time of Jesus, the problem that the Romans faced was the rise of the Parthian Empire. And on it goes. I won't go through them all. Is there not a danger in taking a modern concept of decolonization and reading that back into history for all of these empires where slavery was endemic? We know that even the Jews of Jesus' time used slaves on a regular basis for all kinds of reasons. And yet we take a modern concept, we read it in, and we obliterate in the process the historical context. Is that not a danger for this approach?
Yeah, I do agree that there's a danger that we do exegesis, reading back into the text rather than exegesis. I suppose, put it this way, here's one of the dilemmas that I have, that the Bible, the narrative we see in Scripture from Old Testament to the New Testament, we had all these kingdoms that were there, Egyptian and the ones that you've mentioned. But yet, in today's context, the way we read Scripture, we don't often talk about those empires in those light. So I've been in the church for years. I rarely hear sermons around the implications of Daniel and the Hebrew boys being colonized by the Babylonians. No one really talks about that, but yet it's in the text. And so I'm just like, in our hermeneutics, do we have a selective hermeneutics of how we read this text? Are we choosing some side? Obviously, experiences. So when I look at the story of Daniel and the Hebrew boys, and I saw that their name were changed, immediately I have a reference point. And I'm thinking, yes, as Africans, names were changed. Or even today, I know many Africans who live in Britain who will change their name to John because people cannot pronounce their names. Or will change their name to Mary because people can't pronounce their names. Or they think they might not get a good job if they have their original African names. So they change their names. I remember when my wife is English, and when we got married, she didn't get a job for a while. And one of our old teachers said, perhaps maybe you should change your surname, and then maybe you're going to get a job. Because they were trying to help her by saying, maybe your African surname, now that you're married, is hindering you not getting a job. So this is a reality. And so when I read the text in Daniel, names were changed. Those things are coming to my mind, and I can't ignore them. And I suppose the wisdom of a preacher or a Christian leader who's trying to exegete this text is, what does it say then? Then how do we apply it to now? And then we look at the circumstances of the congregation where people are, and then how does that speak to them in that sense? But I do agree that there's a danger we could read, which is why I said that Jesus didn't go about demonstrating with a placard and saying, oh, we need to get rid of Rome. That's not what he did. What he rather focused on was that he knew there was this Rome, but yet he exhibited power in a very different way, in a subversive way, that he demonstrated something to his disciples that this is not the way. You know that the Gentiles, they lord it over others, but you will exercise servant leadership. So there's those things that we have to read in context as well.
If I may interject as well on that, because I remember as a vicar taking a baptism service one time, so a small child being baptised of an African heritage family, and I could not for the life of me pronounce the name. It was just sort of beyond me to try and get the name in the way that they were clearly saying it. So we actually ended up having a lot of fun together as they tried to teach me exactly how to pronounce the different parts of the name and so on, so that in the service I could get it right, and I could see just how important it was to them, basically, that the name should be pronounced right in the service. So yeah, really significant. Thank you. Let's carry on. Luke, you want to? Yeah, okay.
I've never asked a question at our own lecture before. I usually keep quiet, but Israel, I wonder if I could ask you a question from the perspective of those in the room who agree with you. And really, the simple question is how do we do it? There'll be some in the room who maybe are not people of faith, but they have interest and they have influence. They have spheres of influence, and they're interested in this decolonising word and topic, and there'll be plenty of people in this audience who are people of Christian faith, and if they agree with what you've shared, if we agree with what you've shared, how do we do it?
So I think one key thing that is important, I was in a conversation last night around looking at justice and so on, and we were talking about the need for history when it comes to discipling people. They need to understand history, church history. I think it's important for all of us, whether of faith or no faith or different faiths, to understand history. Our own history, our regional history, world history. I think that's very important, because when we begin to understand that, it will help us to be able to, like for example, when people say, why are so many migrants coming to Britain? To me, it's very obvious. I'm not saying it's right, and I know this is all contested, but it's obvious. Europe, Britain went to the rest of the world at some point. The rest of the world is coming back to Europe and to North America. There is a historical connection for various reasons in that sense. So history helps us. So I would say we all have that task if you want to go on this journey of decolonizing, to understand history. It's part of that educative tool. A second framework is Every one of us, we have questions around our identity, and particularly how that relates to national identity. And so, to those who are Brits, I think there is an ongoing question around what does it mean to be English? What does it mean to be British? And of course, being British is not synonymous to being English. Very important. What does it mean to be Scottish, Irish, Welsh? These are questions that I think people are asking. And so how do we go on a journey of finding answers and solutions to what does that mean? But at the same time, not demonize migrants in trying to understand that. And so we need a kind of a multiple solution or trajectory of how do we empower migrants, but at the same time, how do we empower British indigents who feel there is a loss of something and there is the need to explore and to regain something. How do we go on that journey? And so we need to help each other on that journey. Hence, I talked about the intercultural approach. That, again, it seems to me, it's very crucial in helping each other to understand our identity questions in relation to our nationalism and our identities and so on. So again, that is very crucial in that sense. And then the third point is, what are the collaborative projects in our communities that we can engage in? For those who are in the church, there will be things that we can do in terms of raising profile of some of the conversation. As I said, it's coming to the 5 years of George Floyd. There's a conversation again to be had, because when that happened, a lot of people changed their WhatsApp picture and so on. Many Christian organizations put out statements and so on. 5 years on, what is the measurement? What's the yardstick? And again, we can turn that into those who are not in church and ask the question, 5 years on, what has changed? And what are the community collaborative projects that we need to do together to continue that conversation? So those will be my suggestions.
Yeah, just to put a little bit of humor into everything. There are some things that doesn't seem to matter, but it matters to other people. I will use Yoruba language as example. WA is pronounced wa. When you say wa, you are saying come. When you say wa, you are saying dig. When you say wa, you are saying search. When you say wa, you are driving. So it means different things depending on how you say it. And even if you look at your child in a funny way, to some people, the child knows that he's in trouble. So the same thing with this process of decolonization. Some things we don't take to be important, but it could lead to war. So we have to be very careful. We have to pray about it, that God should open the eyes of our mind so that we be in a position, the little time we have in this world, to make that impact so that we can do it the God's way. Thank you.
Final questions as we start short to close. All right then.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was just thinking about the global church perspective connecting to the intercultural perspective. So I'm just wondering whether globalization kind of added like a very strong concrete to the colonization, where it's so difficult to identify the roots, what you're talking about, bringing that intercultural perspective out. Because I myself sometimes see as a global church representation, I think it's a blessing in a way that we are part of the global community as a church. But somewhere we need to identify, I don't know whether you have an answer for this, but I was just thinking whether you had this a thought about how can we see the blessing at the same time curse? You were giving a perspective about, it's kind of seeing like a curse, but at the same time it was a blessing. I come from a global church and I carry that heritage, very strongly. So how could we help people if they struggle to see this? how could we bring that a joy in the same time?
Now, thank you. I think one of the